So yeah, so far we learned about Spring Boot, how to create Spring Boot project using Spring Starter or by using Spring Toolsuite, and we understand advantages against the old Spring application when we want to develop. What are all the problems that we used to face as a developer? We need to have expertise help to set up the project, but here you don't have that problem. Anybody can set up the project if you have basic understanding what he want to develop. So the great help given in the form of tools and as well as starters, together both helping us a lot. So each starter is having combination of multiple jar files. Okay, Spring Boot starters, Spring Boot given all the jar files in the form of starters. Spring Boot starters, web or Spring Boot starter, data JPA. Exactly, the name may be not the same, but yeah, various types of starters they have given. Web starter, JDBC starter, data JPA starter, security, whatnot, everything, actuator, dev tools, whichever advantage you want to take from Spring Boot, you need to add it as a starter to your application. If you add web, it will give web capabilities. Each starter is having different set of advantages or different set of built-in features given to us. When you add web, it is providing some features. When you add JDBC, it is providing some features. Data JPA will provide some features. So each we need to understand how security will be assisted, how actuator will be assisted, and how DevTools will work. Okay, anything, any feature which you want to utilize in your application, just you need to add it as a starter, and you need not to rush to find out Google or somewhere which starter how to add. Just you can pick any starter from your Spring Initializer. We can pick the starters from Initializer, or you can do it from STS as we did in last two sessions, right? You can use Spring Starter IO. This is the initializer, Spring Initializer. This initializer tool will help you to generate the project, or you can use STS to do that. So everything given in this tool. So depends on your project requirement. You can choose the required starter dependencies from here. Okay, let's, if I start with the web starter, what are all that advantages it provides me if I start using web starter? Or by default without any web starter, just if I create a Spring Boot project, no starter added, what will happen? What are default features it will provide? Okay, so let's understand with the default Spring Boot project. Okay, first let's start with the simple default Spring Boot application. If I create default Spring Boot application, a basic Spring Boot application, what are all things it will provide? Let's understand. And for more documentation, right, about Spring Boot, just visit this documentation part. Spring Boot doc you will get. Let me see. If you search for Spring features list, right? Yeah. This domain is docs.spring.io Spring Boot document. Refer this document to understand all the Spring features. You can see index here. Basic Spring Boot application. Okay. Customizing the banner. Customizing Spring application. Understand application availability. Event listeners. Web environment. Accessing application arguments. Using application runner or command line runner. Application how to exit. Admin features. If you go through, you will see lot of documentation here. How you can externalize your configurations, profiling, logging, internationalization, AOP, how to deal with JSON. See, okay. So few of them we will be discussing in this session. Okay. So you follow this documentation, you will get a lot of help. Okay. Anyway, let's park it aside. Okay, this is just documentation that you guys can follow. I'm sharing you this link. Yeah. So if I create a basic Spring Boot application, just a minute. Yeah, I'm creating a first Spring Boot application. Okay, using STS Spring Starter project. Default starter. Maven Java 17. Okay, packages I'll use the same. Next, I'm not adding any dependencies here. I'm not adding any dependencies here. Next, finish. Simple standalone project getting created now. So this is like your Spring IOC project. When you create a simple project, right? This is like your IOC project. Let's see what all dependencies you get. If it is simple IOC, you know that you can build a standalone application. I can give you one use case also, okay? So default starters, with the default starter, we created a project. Okay, one class generated, one file generated, one test class generated, and one form file. So here in this form file, we can observe Spring Boot starter parent added, and one dependency I can see Spring Boot starter. A default starter added Spring Boot starter, and one Spring Boot testing library added. So what it is providing, if you see, it is providing some default libraries here, some testing libraries. If I go from bottom, I can see Spring testing library, Spring core context, something Spring Boot starter jars, Spring Boot starter logging, Spring Boot test auto config, some jar files added here, and Spring AOP also I can see. So Spring AOP also a default module that is coming here. Spring expressions. Okay. Spring expressions, Spring context core, all this part of your Spring IOC module only. Okay. Spring core module. Consider all these are part of your Spring core module, and additionally AOP module also added to you here by default. So when you create a default project, one starter is getting added here. What is that? Spring Boot starter getting added. Spring Boot starter. Okay. What are all that features it is providing, or what are all that jars it is providing? So the list of jars which it is providing is your IOC jar files, means IOC module jar files, all IOC jars, comma AOP required jars also, means two modules from your Spring. Two modules are default getting added here. Two modules are getting added here. Apart from that, this testing library is adding. Okay, so we'll see about it later. Apart from some default logging library also getting added. This log is not coming from the test. This log is coming from the default Spring Boot starters only. Okay, so log4j or logging libraries. Okay, by default log back or logging jars also added. Logging jars also added. If you see log4j library getting added, sl4j, log4j, log back, three versions of logging getting added here. Okay, we will see how we can use or utilize that default libraries. So as by default for a standalone project, it is providing all this. When you want to create a standalone project, just add the Spring Boot starter. Maybe that is enough for your application. Let's say one use case I'll give you. So I'm getting some unstructured data. I'm getting some unstructured data into a list or from my file. Okay, my requirement is I want to read data from file. I want to read data from file. I want to read data from file, something employees information I'm getting from other system. Generally, right? When you see any big company applications, they used to exchange information between the systems or between their applications. One application may produce a lot of data. That data may be shorted by another application. Data engineers maybe use different tools to do that, or else they may implement it by using simple Java applications also. So I got an employee file, lot of employee information I have there. Some unstructured data I got here into a text file, something employee.txt. Here I am getting their attendance data, leaves information, everything into like employee name A, daily data I'm getting, and he used 3 leaves, and the pending leaves are 4. Okay, and something a chunk of information I'm getting here. I need to structure the data into tables. I want to store that information into tables. So I want to read the data from this unstructured file. I want to read it and I want to process that. Okay, just I want to do some file read. Later I want to apply some conditions on the data and I want to build a object. I want to create one entity out of it and finally I want to save it into table. I want to do this entire process. I want to do this entire process using Java. So if I choose Spring Boot, easily I can able to do all this. For reading, if I write one class, for processing I can write one more class. For saving data into tables, I may use some kind of DAO class, right? So to read, I may write a controller kind of class or read service. Then to process it, something read process. To store it, maybe process DAO or final, something employee DAO, and finally I may save it into tables. To achieve these basic operations, to read and process, simple core Java logic must be enough. Using streams or by using collections, for loops and all, you can apply all the conditions and you can filter out the data. You can get the unstructured data to structured data. Finally, you may need DAO help to save data into tables. There you may need JDBC. First, for the standalone, to achieve these two, to read and to process, if I if I want to select a framework, definitely I'll choose Spring Boot framework because it will provide lot of features to us. By default, it will maintain these objects as singleton and we can auto wire them and we can read properties from properties file. We can do a lot of dependency injection. I can make my application lightweight, loosely coupled. To achieve all that, I'll choose Spring Boot. When I create a default Spring Boot application, it is providing IOC jars and AOP jars and logging jars. So these IOC jars, in case if you want to apply AOP also, you can apply AOP. By default, logging also providing. So I can create my services with log also. Default log library is giving. I can add logging also in my application. As you know, logging is mandatory, right? In any application, right? While you are writing, yeah, yeah, we will come to that. Aspect oriented programming, right? That is one module in Spring that we have not discussed. Okay, we will discuss about that. AOP is a module. Basically, this module on the fly, it will provide you a lot of help on the fly if you want to add any logic without interrupting your existing code, like a new plugin. We can add a new plugin that can apply to all your classes. I'll show you that. Okay, so easy plugins you can implement using AOP. So I'll choose Spring Boot here to implement the simple standalone use case. You can consider it as a standalone because I just want to operate on a file. I want to read file and I want to save it into table. I don't want any user interface here, no web application. Just I want to start this process maybe from timer jobs. Even the timer you can implement using Quad JPA or else maybe some third party timers. Right? There are many tools in the market. Okay, maybe some timer tool will trigger your application every day on the requirement basis. Let's say this process need to execute once in a day. Maybe you may configure that using some timers. Every day at 12 a.m. this process I want to execute. Midnight I want to read that complete day information from the upstream systems. I'll get the data and I'll process it and save it into tables properly. Maybe this data I may getting from some logging machines or employee, the scanners, maybe via scanner machines. They may get some data, employee attendance information, maybe this data a kind of attendance information data, or employee salary information data, or employee transactions, how many times he swiped in swiped out, that information maybe, right? That swipe in swipe out emissions maybe give you in the form of .txt file, lot of junk data, you need to filter it out. As many employees do swipe in swipe out lot many times, they may not record instantly into a database system, but that mission maybe it can give log data in the form of a log file or text file. From there you need to process it, you need to implement another application to read that data and to store it into particular table, so that we can see how many times employee logged in logged out, how much time he is inside office and how much time he went outside. We can get that complete analysis. I'm just giving you example. If you apply this to the stock market or anything, how many times a particular person purchased a stock for that particular day, if he is doing intraday, how many stocks he purchased, how many stocks he's sold on that particular day, how many in and out transactions he has done. To do a lot of junk data when it creates, to analyze that you may need some systems like ETL, extract the data and process it, and then maybe you can generate dashboards to understand how employees or how stocks behaved. Okay, anything. Anything such standalone when you want to implement a default Spring Boot application is enough. What it is going to provide? All your Spring IOC features. Yesterday we have done a simple application, right? Controller, service, repository annotations. By default, at the rate Spring Boot application is scanning all your classes. It is creating objects. So we can use that objects to achieve this simple use case. And we can apply logs also. We can apply AOP also on that. Okay. So if I create a simple Spring Boot application, if I create simple Spring Boot application, it is providing default Spring IOC jars as well as AOP and logging. Along with that, default application is going to provide you testing libraries also. Whichever code you write for this code, if you want to implement test cases, you can implement the test cases also using Mockito. Read service test, your test classes also you can write. Here you can use your JUnit combination of Mockito also to generate your test classes, right? You know the importance of test cases. We need to generally write when you implement any application, they will expect test cases also to understand the how much code you tested. The code coverage they will analyze, or during deployment time, tools will analyze how much code he tested via test cases. So around 80 to 90% if your code is covering, then only they will allow your application to deploy, or else they may block your application from the deployment. That's a different story. So to write test cases also, this default dependency providing testing libraries. Along with the Spring Boot starter, the default Spring Boot application is going to provide you Spring Boot starter test also. Spring Boot starter test also it is providing. So this starter test, which libraries will provide? This is providing all these jars. Okay, Spring Boot starter providing all these jar files. Whereas the starter test is providing you JUnit library and Mockito. So so that you need not to add them separately. By default, it is giving to you. You can just a minute. You can write test case directly. You can write a test case directly. Just a minute. Give me a minute. Okay. So you can implement test cases also by using this testing library. You can implement test cases. So for a normal standalone application, whichever library is required, it is provided. In case if you want to do database operations, add additional jar files. Let's say if you want to use plain core Java JDBC, just add one more jar file, right? You know which jar file you need to add. Oracle jar or MySQL jar, depends on your database you can add, and you can create connection, simple connection, and you can do CRUD operations. Finally, you can close connection. If it is a simple standalone open connection, execute your job and close the connection. Still, if you want to go one step ahead and if you want to use Spring based JDBC, you can add Spring JDBC starter. Or if you want to utilize Spring Data JPA, then you can go with Spring Data JPA starter. Until unless you don't have that requirement, you need not to add anything. Okay, these basic jar files are enough. But to do CRUD operations, you need additional Oracle jar file or MySQL jar file that you need to add. Okay, so now when I create a default Spring Boot application, this is the stuff that it is providing. Okay, apart from this, okay, apart from this, what additional we are getting some default auto configurations. It is providing some default auto configurations. It is providing here auto configure jar, something auto configurations related metadata. I just want to open and see if any information that we can see here. See, lot of properties by default it has been given here. So this is maybe metadata, but you can see all these are properties. All these properties are allowed in your application. Hardly we will use all of them, but you can see lot of Spring Boot auto configuration properties are available. Default configurations, don't disturb them, even we can't edit them. So default values for each property I can see here. Let me search port number, not support, port, server dot port. Okay. So if I see here, it is providing one key property called server dot port, showing us 8080. If you want to understand what are all that default properties, by default it is adding in your application. Okay. By default, some properties are adding to your application without your intervention. You need not to add them. By default, it is adding them. If you see your properties file, you don't see anything here. Nothing. Nothing is here. Don't assume that no property is here so that there are no properties configured to your application. There are properties by default will be added to your application. So all these are default properties that are being added. All these are properties that by default added to your application. Server.servlets.jsp registered. By default it is true. When this property will be enabled when you add web library? Just a minute. So when all these properties will be enabled depends on your module. Okay. Let's say if I add web module, then web dependencies will be enabled. If I use only plain core module, for core I don't believe we have much properties here. Default properties that we are using. Yeah, of course we have logging, right? So observe what logging jar files has been given. HTTP log. Okay, I see only one log. Spring MVC log, log record, log level, something. Default logging properties you may observe here. As and when a property required, we will come here and we will see what is the default value. Okay, see something spring elastic URI default 9200 something it is showing. Lot of defaults. Some properties are like by default they may be true or false. So let's see what are all true properties you have here. When you use open in view something spring JPA, when you add by default one property is true there. Java transactions enabled JTA by default to true. Open phase commit true. Kafka listener. Some properties are default true. MVC form content filter. Don't worry that do I need to know about each property means nothing. As per our examples, whatever are required that we enable them or disable them. Server encoding, JSP class name, JSP registered, SSL is enabled, AOP auto. Some suggestions also given here. Description. This is true, but they are telling enable auto as aspect J in the description. Okay. So read the descriptions also. They helps you a lot. Default batch is enabled. Execute all Spring Batch jobs in the context on startup. Lot of good stuff. Okay, go through it. Okay, lot of defaults are enabling, but let's say server dot port is 8080. That is by default is available, but this is not applicable on standalone. This is not applicable on standalone. When you add web library only, this will be enabled, which means by default a lot of properties also it is providing. Along with this, what it is providing, lot of default properties also. Default properties providing. Default properties also provided. Default properties also provided. So what if I don't want that default property? What I should do? Here server port number 8080 given. I don't want the default port. So whichever you don't want to defaults, you can override them from application properties files. Okay, override override default if you don't want from application dot properties file. Application properties file is the main key file in Spring Boot. This is the place where we configure our required additional properties or existing default properties. Everything will be configured into this file only. So this is very important key file to us. So during coding, if you want to enable or disable some existings, you can go to this application properties file, you can disable or enable them. And if you want to understand what are all the defaults you have, just explore this. Okay, find if you have any better approach, right? Module wise, what defaults we have, you can explore that also. Okay, there is one more file. These all are the auto configuration classes. Okay, what these classes will do if you try to explore these classes, auto configuration, batch auto, catch auto configuration. Let me search for data source auto configuration. There are so many classes. There are so many classes. By default, they are in your class path, right? If they are in your class path, now they are not there. For suppose, I mean, Spring Boot is having so many modules, right? Out of all that modules, there will be some auto configuration classes. Yet I did not added data JPA or yet I did not added JDBC. Still, whatever auto configurations classes will be there in the next to starters, those classes also configured here. Those are simple names, just names configured here. In case, for suppose you added one module, Spring Web module, or you added one JDBC module. Okay, when you add JDBC module, I wanted to create a connection or data source connection pool from JDBC module. Instead you doing it, if there is a class that automatically can recognize, okay, you added JDBC, so I know the purpose why you added, you want to do CRUD operations. So the best approach is we need a connection pool. If Spring says, I know that you need a connection pool object that I will create. I understand your requirement. You just added starter, that is sufficient for me. I'll be creating you a data source. How I am recognizing is, Spring Boot says, how I am recognizing is, in my defaults, those auto configuration classes are already there. So when you add that particular dependency, I'll identify this class, and I'll enable it, auto configuration class. This class basically is a configuration class, like how we implemented before using @configuration, @bean method, how we implemented. Similarly, this class is going to be implemented and provided to you. Who will implement? As part of Spring Boot jar file, that implementation by default will be available. If you search for it, data source auto configuration, you can see, this is a configuration class, a kind of configuration class which is invoking data source properties. And here we have a lot of methods and the at the rate bean method we have some pool code, lot of code they implemented and given to you, which means end of the day it is going to create one connection pool for you. And this class object you need not to create, it will create. Why? Because these all classes, whichever classes you add from the Spring library, right, by default they will be under Spring Radar only. Spring Radar in the sense, whichever default libraries or whichever libraries you add, those all libraries it will do auto scan. Yesterday we see that the classes which are there in this current package, it is scanning. Apart from that, it will scan all the defaults also, all Spring libraries. It can scan all Spring libraries. Out of your Spring libraries, if there is any class that is configured with your stereotype, automatically that class object will be initialized. So all the default configuration classes will have at the rate configuration annotation, so that that class object by default your Spring Boot application will create. Just you need to imagine that, or you need to understand that, okay, this class object is creating whichever beans are getting created here, those beans I need to auto wire myself wherever I require. So this default data source class will create finally which object? Data source object. It produces data source object, so that finally I can auto wire data source anywhere. For the data source, if I auto wire anywhere, usually I used to create data source configuration. Now I need not to create, already a class implemented and given. And in core module itself, they mentioned those class names also. If developer adds any Spring JDBC dependency, I am mentioning here itself in Spring core itself. If you find out this data source class from his library, let's create that configuration automatically. Let's execute it. Okay. To execute default configurations, I need to add that particular jar dependency so that it will execute it automatically. In case if I want to disable that, so many default configurations has been given, maybe I don't know whether I need them or not. I just want to disable them. I just want to disable them. If you want to disable them, you can disable. If you don't want all these default configurations, let's say I added Spring Data JPA. For data JPA, something JPA repository auto configuration is getting executed. Or for JDBC repositories auto configuration something getting executed. I don't want it. I am writing my custom logic only. So as my custom logic is sufficient, I don't want all this execution. So I should able to disable them. From executing default to disable them. You can disable it also. As you know all these class names, you can take this class name and you can configure it in your Spring Boot application. You can configure it in Spring Boot application here. You can configure it in your Spring Boot application. If there is anything you want to disable, you can exclude them. Exclude specific auto configuration class name such they will never be applied. Exclude class. Just if you want to give class, you can give class here. Data source auto configuration class dot class. It will be disabled. So like that, whichever classes you want to exclude, you may exclude here. So that by default execution will not happen. Array of names, if you want to give here, array of names. Something A class I want to disable, B class I want to disable, C I want to disable. Why I need to disable them? I don't want them, as I want to write my custom configuration logic. In that scenario only, you need to disable them. Why they did all this stuff means to make our job simple. Why they made everything default, auto configurations. because they don't want to put that burden on you. Whenever you add a dependency, by default, automatically they want to pick it up and add that to your application by default. In case if you want to customize it, you can customize them. You can disable existing things and you can enable your custom things. Enabling custom things need not to add anything. As you know, components can will read your configurations and your beans. Yesterday we did that exercise. So here you can use AOP as well as Spring IOC and logging also when we add Spring default dependency. Okay. So as you know from IOC we achieved it. Component scan, auto wiring. Those are the main key features that we need to see, right? So yesterday we did that. Spring Boot application was scanning all our classes by default and it is creating objects to them. It is creating objects to them. By default internally it will start your application context. As we created a standalone project, right? So which container it will use when we add defaults, the default container name is application context only. By default it will use your application context only. Application context will be used. Yeah. So by default application context will be used here. I hope this font is fine. Yeah. So by default your application context object will be created because only IOC jars we have. We don't have any web jars. So by default application context also will be created to you. Okay. So you can get that application context object in case if you want, you can get it. If you can put reference here, it will give you application context object. Spring application dot run method can provide you this application context object. Without any hesitation, you can get that object if you want. What you can get out of it? Yeah, yeah. Hmm. No, 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 not required. If you have seen yesterday's session, right? When I mentioned it, if you follow the naming convention, I told here component scan will be performed by default. But on which package? The scans on which package? It will perform component scan on current package. Current package means your Spring Boot application is part of com.rbu.pms.admin. So this is my package. If your classes are falling under this package, then by default it will perform scanning. In case if you don't follow that naming convention, yesterday I created intentionally, instead of this I created rbu.pms.manager. Inside not admin, a neighbor package I created. So obviously it will not perform scanning on the neighbor packages. It will perform scanning only within this package, any class or any child. That is the only way it can scan. So in that scenario, you can put the package name, whichever packages you want to additionally add. Generally, we follow naming convention. Don't ignore that. Follow proper naming convention so that you never face this issue. Many people are struggling. They used to create classes, but they will see null pointer exceptions because those objects it will not create. When they auto-wire and try to execute it, they will see null pointer exceptions. They will not notice that whether properly this package naming conventions they used or not. Okay, in real time also I saw many. It's okay. When they are not aware, they don't know that it is not creating the object. But you, while creating, follow naming convention. Don't create random package names. While generating application, why we have given this name? We are giving a name here. The package name, group name, and package name. So as you given this as a standard, you need to follow that. Your all child packages should fall under that main package naming convention only. Okay, that's how you can automatically create all the objects. Otherwise, additionally, you use scan based package to create objects. Okay. And as we are dealing with only core, right? In case if you want your objects, whichever objects it is creating, all these objects it will create. Right. Your controllers, utilities, whatnot, everything it will create. So you can get that object here, ab dot get bean of whichever class, like right? I got application context object. I can play with it now. Admin controller I want, get it. Whichever object you want, you can get it. Like this is a IOC application. I can play it as IOC application. Like here I want to call this read service class from my main method. So in my Spring Boot main method class, obviously I need this read service class object. So if I have application context object, I can get application context dot get bean. The read service class name I can give, so that I can get that object and I can execute the further flow. Read service dot may be there if you have a read method. That read method may call read process may call. In a chain it will go, when they auto void proper. So here you have that benefit also. Spring application dot run method, when it's load this class, it will read this annotation. Here it will identify and understand, it need to enable default configurations, and it need to perform default component scanning also. So it will do that component scan, unlike your or like your XML approach, how we load XML and create objects. Similarly, it will load your annotation and understands what are all packages need to be scanned and object need to be created, so it will create them. So generally, if you understand from their framework point of view, for them it's okay via annotation you provide configuration or via XML, it's up to you. Okay, so this is most prominent or the current way that people are using, everything providing via annotations only, and this is the most easiest approach. Okay, so by default, whatever package naming convention you followed, that one first it will consider, and it will load all your classes and it will create objects. So finally, if you want that particular application context object, obviously if it is a standalone application, you need that context object, because you need to trigger your controller. As I don't have any front end, I need to trigger it myself, or I need to trigger it from a job. Okay, consider this class is directly executing by a job via jar file something. So I need to get my controller object here, and I need to execute the next chain of methods. So I need to get that object and I need to execute. So for that purpose, your application context object also they are returning here. So you can utilize that as well. Okay. Yeah. So there is so much that we need to discuss in this default itself. Okay. So tomorrow we will continue. Okay. Tomorrow we will continue and I'll cover all this. Then only I'll jump into the next module. Okay. So first we will see all the core features like Spring Banner. They are telling, right? Spring Starter, we can start, we can exit, what are all that, we'll see them. Then next, I'll show you logging. AOP I'll keep it aside. Okay, AOP I'll keep it aside, I'll explain this later. Okay, yeah, AOP is simple, but it will deviate you from others, other understanding or other learning curve. So I don't want make it now. Okay, we'll see it maybe end of these all modules. Okay, yeah. So that's it for today. We'll continue tomorrow, and we will see more in detail what by default it is providing. Okay, lot of features giving here. Okay, let's see each how I can use them. Okay, yeah.